Have you ever wondered why some people effortlessly persuade others, captivate audiences, or inspire action, all with just their words? What if you could do the same? Welcome to Jonah Berger's Magic Words, a book that unveils the secrets behind the language that influences minds and drives action. By the end of this video, you'll discover 1. How to activate identities, so learning how to use words that not only convey messages, but also shape how others see themselves and you. 2. The Art of Conveying Confidence, so master language techniques that make you appear more self-assured and persuasive. 3. Strategies to ask the right questions, so unlock the power of inquiry to build deeper connections and elicit valuable information. So welcome to our channel Wise Words, where we're dedicated to distilling impactful ideas from great books and turning them into actionable insights for you. If you find value in today's video, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep creating content like this.
Yeah, so let's get stuck into the introduction then. So words shape our world. They influence how we think, how we feel, and most importantly, how we connect with others. Whether we're giving a presentation, writing an email, or having a conversation with a loved one, the words we choose matter. But here's something that often gets overlooked. While we focus on the ideas we want to share, we rarely think about how we're saying them. The truth is, specific words hold unique power. They can transform our ability to persuade, connect, and lead. Take this simple example. Using the word recommend instead of like increases the chances that someone will follow your suggestion by 32%. That's a big change for such a small world. So what if we could tap into this hidden power of language every day? This brings us to the core pillar of today's book summary, the mastering of 6 types of magic words that can help us communicate better and influence others more effectively. So you ready? Let's dive into the 6 types of magic words.
Cool. So moving on to chapter 1, which is activate identity and agency. So let's start with a question. How do you persuade someone to do something they don't want to do, like cleaning up when they're already having fun? This first chapter takes a fascinating look at how simple changes in language can turn reluctant helpers into enthusiastic ones. It's not just about what we ask, but how we ask it.
The experiment, help versus helper. Scientists conducted a clever experiment to see if changing a single word could make children more willing to clean up. They asked one group of children to help tidy up toys and another group to be a helper. Even though the request was almost the same, the second group responded much better. Why is that? Well, here's something most people miss, but it's absolutely essential. Using identity labels, like helper instead of help, changes how people view themselves. When you ask someone to be something, it becomes about their identity, not just a temporary action. People are more likely to act in line with who they believe they are.
So, turning actions into identities. Now let's think about this. If I tell you that Rebecca goes running and Fred is a runner, who do you think enjoys running more? You probably say Fred, right? That's because describing someone with a category label like runner implies that it's part of who they are, not just something they do once in a while. So let me share a truth that changes everything. When we label someone as a helper or a leader, it feels like a more permanent part of their identity. Studies show that when people are labeled this way, they're more likely to keep doing those behaviors in the future. For example, calling someone a coffee drinker, like myself, makes it seem like they keep drinking coffee even if their preferences shift over time. This idea works in so many situations, whether it's on a resume or encouraging teamwork. If you want people to be more innovative, call them innovators, not just creative thinkers.
Yeah, so changing behavior with labels. But the power of labels doesn't stop at how we're perceived. It can also change how we act. By framing actions as part of someone's identity, you can guide their behavior. For example, instead of asking a child to help clean up, ask them to be a helper. It's no longer just a task, it's about being a good person. This turns actions into opportunities for people to affirm a positive identity. And this is the most crucial piece of the puzzle. Want people to stop a negative behavior? Use the same principle. Research found that saying don't be a cheater works better than just saying don't cheat. And why is this? Well, because cheating isn't just an action, it's about avoiding a negative identity. And the same goes for don't be a litter bug versus don't litter. And I think these are really good points that we've kind of touched on in different books before. But for example, with like Atomic Habits, the idea of I want to be, I'm a runner. And once you like give yourself that goal to kind of pursue, then it becomes all encompassing rather than, okay, it's just an action and then I'm done, like, oh, I'm just going to help today rather than I am a helper. And it also, I think it also brings in kind of, if you're attributing it to someone else, it's almost alter casting once again. You're giving them a role to perform in. It's like, be the helper, don't be a cheater. And it's like, it's quite interesting how as soon as you kind of, the language is more entwined with identity, people take it in and take it on board to a much deeper level.
Yeah, I find it quite interesting as well because it kind of goes against a little bit the non-violent communication and sort of the argumentative books where it talks a lot about when you're actually criticizing somebody, you try to avoid using identity. You kind of label it as a behavior rather than that. But I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I think it's useful in certain situations, right? Like in this point, it's like if you want somebody to do something or if you want them to stop doing something, use identity because it's powerful and it gives them a standard to live up to, right? Whereas before in the other case where you're trying to criticize somebody to try and get them to do something differently, whatever, you're going to try and avoid labeling them as it's part of their character. Because if you do that, once again, I think if anything, it proves this point. If you label it as part of their character, it's harder to change, or it's perceived to be harder to change, and it's more of an insult. Whereas if you can say, "Oh, you cheated this game," it's way different to "you're a cheater" kind of thing. And I think therefore you can use it in two different ways, right? You can use it obviously one to persuade in a way that tries to stop them from doing negative behaviors, or make them help out by labeling them a helper. But then you have the opposite end of the spectrum, which is when you're trying to give criticism, you can then dial that back and not use identity and basically label the behavior instead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we touched on that also in was it Shattered Assumptions, the difference between like characterological and behavioral kind of blame.
Yes, exactly.
And so if you blame an action, then it can change. But if you're blaming just them, who they are, then it can be negative. So I guess with this kind of thing, it very much depends on the context of what you're talking about.
100%. It's like stop procrastinating, being stop being a procrastinator. There's just a different weight to it, right? And I guess that's the whole point of this. It's when it's characterological, like you said, there's just more weight. Therefore, I think if it is a tool once again, like everything we discuss around communication, it's a tool for persuasion, even if it involves persuading yourself, maybe as well. Like you can label yourself. I'm not just I'm a creator. I'm somebody who does that. That's my identity. Like you said with Atomic Habits, which was a good point. That is kind of like the pull, the motivation for some people, isn't it? By labeling it as a part of who they are rather than just a behavior, and therefore it should be used as a tool once again.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So moving on from identity, we're now going to move change can'ts to don'ts. So language doesn't just shape identity; it shapes how we see control over our choices. When we say "I can't," it feels like something external is stopping us, like a rule or a person. But saying "I don't" shifts the control to ourselves. It implies that we choose not to do something, making it a stronger internal commitment. For example, "I don't eat junk food" is more empowering than "I can't eat junk food." It feels like a decision, not a restriction.
I do like this point actually, and it's kind of a common theme through a number of his points throughout the book. But I just like, once again, it's entwined with your identity, and so it's heavier, it's more meaningful. You place more value on it by saying "I don't eat junk food." You're stating that you're someone who doesn't eat it, rather than there's a restriction on it. And sometimes
the can't almost implies a reason, right? Like if you say "I can't," there's something that can be overcome, like a resistance that could be. Where "don't" is so definitive, and "can't" is kind of like there is something underlying that's stopping you, and therefore you could be persuaded, right?
And I think it also kind of brings in this aspect of, we're constantly like fluctuating in our internal state, and sometimes we do find, a lot of the time we find justifications to do actions that we know we shouldn't do, but we do anyway. And so when you say, "I can't eat junk food," like you said, you're insinuating that there's a restriction there. But depending on our state, we might justify or rationalize why we don't need to abide by that restriction right now. Whereas if we say "I don't eat junk food," it doesn't even bring that into the conversation,
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially another classic example would be something like drinking. And I think it's quite interesting let's just say you meet a friend at a pub or whatever, or a bar, and they say to you, "Oh, I can't drink at the moment." You'll kind of be like, "Why?" And if they say "I don't drink," you might still ask why, but it just feels that extra bit of weight behind it that you wouldn't even question it. Or somebody says, "I don't drink during the week." and you're like, or compared to I can't drink during the week,
Yeah,
you'd be a
yeah,
bit like, okay, why not? And you'd be like, oh, because I wake up. But the don't is just like, okay, that is a rule I've imposed on myself.
yeah.
It is non-negotiable, and there is something about that. And I like the idea of using it with your self-talk
Mm,
to try and build an identity. Like, I don't, for example, maybe we use Atomic Habits here, where he talks a lot about not missing 2 days in a row. You're like, I do not miss 2 days in a row of my habits.
yeah,
Um, I
yeah,
quite like that rather than I can't miss 2 days. There's something about just switching those words.
absolutely. And I like the point that you were saying, like, it's less contestable.
Yes.
You're not going to contest someone on who they are, really. Like, you might ask questions and you might dive in a bit deeper, but you're not going to challenge them on who they are, whereas you're more likely to challenge someone on just an action, you know?
That's
Because
actually a really good point, because I guess can is
there's
the word to like,
not as much at stake, you know?
just thinking of like the root of it, like can is like being able to, so it almost invites a question of like why can't you do that, whereas don't,
Yeah.
there's just something about it. Yeah, hard to explain, but there is a difference.
Yeah, it's interesting. All right, so then, the action plan for all of these is, this is how you can apply the key ideas from this chapter. So you want to, one, use identity labels. So frame tasks and actions as part of someone's identity. Instead of asking someone to help, ask them to be a helper. Turn verbs into nouns that reflect a desired identity. And then number two, avoid negative identities. So when you want to discourage a behavior, use identity labels to frame the action negatively. Say, don't be a liar, not just don't lie. It's about protecting their self-image. And lastly, number three, shift from can't to don't. So when you face a temptation, don't say, I can't. Instead, say, I don't. This shift gives you control over your choices and makes it easier to stick to your decisions.
Great overview. So now moving on to chapter 2, conveying confidence. So have you ever noticed that some people just seem to command attention when they speak? They might not be louder, funnier, or even more knowledgeable, but somehow their words carry weight. This chapter explores exactly why that happens, and more importantly, how you can learn to speak with that same kind of power.
So the secret to powerful language. So here's the big takeaway. Speaking with power isn't something you're born with, it's a skill you can build. It's all about the small tweaks in how you phrase things, your choices of words, and the confidence you project. Research has broken it down into 4 main areas you can focus on to boost your communication. So number 1, ditch the hedges. 2, don't hesitate. 3, turn pasts into presents. And 4, know when to express doubt. So let's break these down one by one.
So, number 1, ditch the hedges. So have you ever heard someone say, I think this could work, or it might be a good idea? Notice how it sounds less convincing. That's because those little words, might, think, maybe, are what we call hedges. They make your statement sound uncertain and undermine your authority. So let's be clear about this. If you want to sound confident, avoid hedging your statements. Instead, use powerful, definitive words like definitely, clearly, and obviously. Saying this might work versus this definitely works sends a very different message. The first one feels weak and unsure, the second one feels confident and persuasive. Think about people like Donald Trump or Steve Jobs. Whatever you think of them, one thing's for sure: they didn't hedge their language. They spoke in absolutes. This is the best, everyone will love this, or it's guaranteed to succeed. Their lack of doubt made them sound more convincing.
It's an interesting point. I mean, it's like, I guess it depends on who is speaking, because when a scientist says something in absolutes, I straight away, get frustrated because I know that there aren't absolutes really, and it just makes something sound more convincing than it actually is. But I do understand the point of it, and especially I think if you're like a leader and you want people to actually confide in you and everything, then speaking kind of absolute, like they were saying, like Donald Trump and Steve Jobs, who are leaders, that language makes a big difference. But you can also see why people use the other kind of language, because I mean, it's my favorite words, plausible deniability. It gives you like some room to basically be like, well, I never said it was 100%, and yeah, it kind of gets you off the hook a little bit. But I think sometimes you have to kind of actually be quite confident with what you say, and it makes a world of difference.
Yeah, I think once again this is to do with tools. I think not everybody is inclined to think the way you do, and personally I do as well, with the idea of, there is no such thing as like a dead certainty, unless of course you're talking about maybe some parts of physics. So yeah, but once I do think a lot of people don't think like that, and they actually require that sort of certainty to even put their trust in somebody. They're unlikely to put trust in somebody who doesn't seem to have a clear plan, even if that plan's wrong. I think there is some use. Once again, this is a tool. It's not, it's not scientifically true to just be like, this is definitely the way to do things. But it's a good way to obviously convey that you're confident in what you're saying, which I think is a big part of, convincing others.
So the second point then is don't hesitate. So we all do it sometimes, fill our speeches with or and if you've been listening to this podcast, you probably have heard many of them. It's a natural habit, but overusing these filler words can make us sound uncertain and less authoritative. But here's something most people miss, but it's an absolute essential. Too many ums and ers weaken your message and make you appear less sure of what you're saying. If you need a moment to think, pause instead. Pause rather than a verbal tick makes you seem more in control and more thoughtful. Think of how effective speakers like Barack Obama use pauses to emphasize points. No needed. And trying to actually implement this feels so odd when there's just like, you really want to fill that space, that silence. But you just if you train yourself more and more to just be able to sit with silence a little bit more, then
it's a weird urge, isn't it? It's like one of those things. I completely get you. It's so unnatural to allow a pause.
Yeah.
But everybody who I watch and see who's I would classify as like a master communicator, I've noticed they literally are really good at it. They rarely, maybe you slip up, you will slip up from time to time, because I don't think it's possible to completely iron out that urge.
Yeah.
But they definitely got better at the pausing. And in fact, funny enough, on that, I watched a guy yesterday on YouTube who talked about the ways to remove those tics, and one of them was obviously pausing. But another one which I quite enjoyed was articulating the last letter of every word, because then if you have to fully articulate the word, that gives you enough time to kind of control it.
Yeah, interesting.
Which wasn't mentioned in this book, but I just thought it was a good little tidbit. Funny enough, look at that. There you go. That was just absolute pure urge. I couldn't even let it. Right. 3. So let's go into part 3. Turn past into presence. So here's a surprising way to add power to your language. Use the present tense whenever you can. Why is this? Because the present tense makes what you're saying feel more immediate and more real. Compare these two statements. That restaurant was great versus that restaurant is great. Which sounds stronger? The second one, obviously. The present tense suggests that your statement is true now and will continue to be true, making it feel more convincing. So let me share a truth that changes everything. When you say, the study found, it sounds like an event that's over. But saying the study finds makes it feel more current and relevant. So what's the result? Your words carry more weight because they seem like universal truths, not just observations tied to a specific moment in time. And I quite like that point as well.
Yeah, I do as well.
Something about you just changing that past tense to present whenever you can. And there's no... I guess once again, it is tying into that level of definitively at the beginning, but I can see the use for it because it definitely seems more convincing when it's studies found, a study finds. Yeah. Once again, I just find it so interesting how, and obviously this is the point of the whole entire book, but how small wording changes can really make that massive difference, more than we really think about until obviously we're provided with examples of this, and then reflect on it a little bit and you think, oh wow, that makes sense.
Yeah, we take words for granted, and we speak in a way that everyone else speaks, and so it just becomes normal, becomes the status quo, but we don't actually think about the specific words. And then when you actually do, it's oh wow, that's shaping how I view something. And I find that really interesting, literally just swapping one word here and there completely changes of how how we perceive time, or how we perceive some kind of concept in relation to time in this case. I think it's pretty interesting, actually. Yeah. All right. So moving on. So number 4, know when to express doubt. So know you might think that. Oh, Mark, Number 4, know when to express doubt. So now you might think that to sound powerful, you should never show uncertainty. But here's the twist. Sometimes expressing doubt can actually make you more persuasive. When you're discussing a contentious topic, being open about your own uncertainties shows humility and makes you seem more balanced and trustworthy. For example, imagine you're talking about climate change and with someone who strongly disagrees. If you say, "I'm absolutely sure that climate change is caused by humans," it might make them defensive. But if you say, "I believe climate change is caused by humans, but I understand there's debate on some aspects," you're acknowledging complexity and making them more willing to listen. It's a way of opening the door to conversations rather than slamming it shut. And I think this is a very good point that kind of should, well, actually, I don't think they really talked about in How to Have Impossible Conversations, but you can see how this kind of, technique can be used to bridge gaps between very contentious issues, which at the moment, with everything going on in the world, is probably quite a good technique to take on board.
I think it does touch on it roughly, but it doesn't say it the same way. I think for this exact example, this is the idea of modeling the behavior you kind of want the other person to show, which is kind of admitting that you don't know everything about it, and therefore you're hoping by doing that, one, that you obviously haven't put a stake in the ground, so they're obviously gonna be like, "Oh my god, I can't get on with this person." But you're showing them that you're willing to change your mind, which hopefully they will reciprocate, but not necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, so at the end of the chapter, we have the action plan. So here's how you can start speaking with more power and confidence today. So number 1, replace hedges with definitive words. Next time you're about to say "I think" or "maybe," switch to "I'm confident" or "this is clear." Practice saying things definitively, even when you feel unsure. It will make a difference in how others perceive you. 2, pause instead of filling space. Pay attention to when you say or "are." Instead of using these filler words, try pausing. Take a breath. This will make your speech more powerful and give the impression that you're choosing your words carefully. 3, use present tense whenever possible. When describing an action, a result, or experience, shift from did and was to does and is. This small change can make your statements feel more relevant and persuasive. And lastly, know when to show doubt. If you're discussing a topic where people hold strong opposing views, express a bit of uncertainty. It will show that you're open-minded and respectful of others' perspectives, making people more likely to engage with you.
Absolutely. All right. So moving on to chapter 3, ask the right questions. So what's more powerful, telling someone they're smart or asking for their advice? It might surprise you, but research shows that asking for advice makes people more valued and competent than just giving them a compliment. In this chapter, we'll explore why asking the right question can change how people perceive you and improve the quality of your conversations.
So, the power of asking. When you ask someone for advice, you're doing more than gathering information. You're showing them that you value their opinion. And here's something that most people miss, but is absolutely essential. Asking for advice makes people feel respected and intelligent. It's a subtle but powerful way of building rapport. Rather than just telling someone they're great, asking for their input shows that you believe in their competence and boosts their self-esteem. But here's the key. Not all questions are created equal. Some questions lead to better connections, more useful information, and stronger relationships than others. In this chapter, we'll look at the 4 strategies to ask better questions and make your conversations more impactful. So these are following up, deflecting difficulty, avoid making assumptions, start safe, then build.
Yeah, so let's tuck into follow up. So think about a first date or even a doctor's visit. Research shows that the people we like the most are the ones who ask more questions, especially follow-up questions. These questions show that you're not just listening, but that you're genuinely interested in the other person's thoughts and experiences. Let me share a truth that changes everything, though. So follow-up questions are your secret weapon in any conversation. They signal that you're paying attention and care about what the other person has to say. For example, if someone tells you they recently went on a trip, instead of just moving on, ask them, "What was the highlight of your trip?" Or "What was the most inspiring thing you saw?" This invites them to share more, deepening the connection. Whether it's casual chat or business meeting, following up makes the other person feel heard and understood, which leads to more positive impressions.
So number 2 then, deflect difficulty. We all face tough questions sometimes, whether it's during a job interview or negotiating a price. Answering directly can sometimes be uncomfortable, and refusing to answer can seem defensive. There's a third option, deflecting. The key point when you strip everything away is this. When you deflect a difficult question, you're not avoiding it, you're just steering the conversation. Let's say you're asked about your last salary in an interview, but you'd rather not reveal it. Instead of dodging the question, try deflecting with a question of your own, like, could you share the typical salary range for this role? Deflection works because it shows you're engaged in the conversation or shifting the focus to something more comfortable for you. It's a way of staying in control without coming across as evasive.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'd like to put this to the test, and I think I probably have done it, but it almost seems like too theoretical. Do you know what I mean?
It's like the politicians, isn't it? Where you
Yeah, yeah,
constantly like
exactly. I think
either
it's
answering a different question or reframing it. But then I've seen it before, and like which Peterson does it a lot. And when somebody asks him a question, he kind of automatically reframes the question to something else.
yeah. I think it's a typical, yeah, like you said, it's typical kind of politicians, or
I think there's an art to it, though.
PR kind of training.
Yeah, but then at the
Don't
same
ask the
time, I think
question.
there's certain ways to do it where I think it works quite effectively. So like,
Mm.
if you're a politician and somebody asks you a tough question and you've completely ignored it and gone on to something else, fine, that's pretty bad. But I guess the point here that he's trying to make is if you deflect the question but in a way that seems relevant to the actual question, then I think you can kind of get away with it.
Yeah.
Um, if you, for example, maybe redefine the issue but still talk about the issue, in my head, all you're trying to do there is fine. You might be deflecting a little bit, but you're just trying to make the terms in your favor, which is fair enough, I
Yeah.
think. But I guess we're talking here where politicians are asked a tough question. They completely gloss over it massively. Don't even
Yeah.
try and engage with it.
Yeah. No, it's true. Yeah, they fucking do. God. All right. So number 3, avoid making assumptions. So when we ask questions, especially about sensitive topics, the way we phrase them matters. Asking a question like, there aren't any problems with this product, are there? Assumes that everything is fine, which can discourage people from being honest. But here's something most people miss, but it's an absolute essential. To get truthful answers, avoid leading questions that assume everything is positive. Instead, ask open-ended questions that encourage more candid responses. For example, instead of asking, you don't have any concerns, do you? Try asking, what concerns do you have? This approach invites the other person to be honest and share any issues they might otherwise hold back. And when you stop and make assumptions and open the door for full disclosure, you get better information and create a more honest dialogue. And I really like this point actually, because it's, you've got nothing to lose by framing a question that assumes that there is something, because then they can just be like, oh no, that's fine. Like there's nothing wrong with it. But it just opens it. It makes it more. It makes it easier for the other person to open up and like be honest about it. Yeah,
For sure.
so
No, I
I
like
quite
that.
like these actually.
It kind of reminds me as well a bit like the never split the difference. When you kind of mislabel, so you almost hear misassuming that there is issues, which is good.
Yeah.
It's good because one, if there is, they'll be more open to talk about it, and then two, if not, they will correct you. A bit like when you mislabel somebody, like, oh, it seems like you're angry, and they're like, oh, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed or something like that.
Yeah.
So last point. So start safe, then build. So not all questions are appropriate for every stage of a conversation. Asking deeply personal questions too soon can feel intrusive, or sticking to small talk might prevent you from forming a deeper connection. So if there's just one takeaway from today, it's this. Start with simple, non-threatening questions to warm up the conversation, and then gradually move toward deeper, more thoughtful ones. For example, begin with light questions like, how did you spend your weekend? And once the conversation flows, you can ask something more reflective like, what's been the most rewarding part of your job lately? This progression helps build trust and encourages the other person to open up at their own pace. Thoughtful questions foster deep connections by inviting self-disclosure, which is the key to building closer relationships. And this is just small talk 101, isn't it, really? It's start with the weather, as we do in England, and then move on to, existential crises. And then
It's funny because, like, although it's just so simple, this point, like, everyone knows it, I don't think you really think about it. I don't think you think of depth being a factor in the question you're asking. You just ask the question because it's come about from the context that you're talking about, conversation that you're having, right? It's like you'd only ask something that's really deep because you've come from somewhere else where it seems more natural to ask that kind of question, right? But it is interesting how when you do think about the factor of like depth to a question, then you can kind of track this kind of incremental increase, you know, and how it makes sense that, like, you know, if you want to build a relationship, you get to know someone on a deeper level. And like, I find a prime example of that is when I'm doing like extra work and you're on set for like 10 hours of the day, and you kind of stick with the same person and you talk to, like, it's such a social job. So you talk to them for so long. By the end of the day, you know, you've covered politics, you've covered their upbringing, everything. And it's just like, it's funny because, you know, at the very beginning of the day, like you said, you're talking about the weather, and now you're in this, like, you know everything about this person to an extent that you know that more than friends that you actually have, because you never really sit down and talk that long with, like, you know, mates in one day. But it's funny to see that, like, it's definitely, you know, an underlining factor that kind of determines how close you are with someone.
100%.
Yeah.
Like you said, I think the interesting point about here is making sure the deeper sort of questions kind of come naturally through the conversation. You know, it's not just like you randomly stop the conversation. It's like, okay, so, like, you know, what is your deeper political view? You know, you don't really. It has to, like, flow naturally, right? I mean, I guess you could technically do that. You
It's
could,
so
like,
funny
it,
because I know of lots of people where they're a bit tactless and they can't really read that. And so you go from something that is quite, like, you know, superficial to suddenly, like, really deep. And it's like there was no bridge, and it seems really intense, that question. Whereas, like, you know, if you got there naturally, it probably.
I mean, I guess technically you could preface it with, like, look, you know, I'm going to ask you really, like, you know, this is nothing we've been talking about, but I'm going to ask you, like, a weird question now. But you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. That's, I guess, a tiny bit more tactful, but
yeah. Funny. All right, so then let's go into the action plan. So here's how you can apply the ideas from this chapter to ask better questions and create more meaningful conversations. So number 1, follow up to show interest. In your next conversation, make it a point to ask at least one follow-up question. It shows you're actively listening and makes the other person feel valued. Then number 2, use deflection in tough situations. So when faced with a difficult question, try deflecting by asking a related question instead. This keeps the conversation going while helping you maintain control. Number 3, avoid leading questions. So rephrase your questions to be open-ended and non-assumptive. Instead of asking everything's fine, right? Ask, what issues are you noticing? This encourages more honest responses. And lastly, number 4, start safe, then build. So begin conversations with simple questions to break the ice, and then gradually move towards deeper, more reflective questions to foster meaningful connections.
Awesome. So now we're moving on to chapter 4. So leverage concreteness. So have you ever noticed how some words paint a clear picture while others leave you guessing? That's the power of concrete language. In this chapter, we explore why using specific detailed words can make a huge difference in how people respond to you, and when it's actually better to stay abstract. The magic here is knowing when to switch between the two.
Yes, so how to make people feel heard. So imagine calling customer service and hearing the rep say, "I'll help you with that." Sounds okay, right? But what if they said, "I'll help you find those lime green Nikes you're looking for"? Feels better, doesn't it? That's because concrete language makes people feel heard. And here's something most people miss. The more specific you are, the more people feel like you're really listening. Concrete words show that you're paying attention to the details, not just going through the motions, not emotions. For example, if someone asks about a delivery, saying your package will arrive at your door tomorrow feels much more personal than just it'll arrive soon. This works because it shows you've not only listened but understood exactly what they need. Concrete language signals to people that you're invested in helping them with their specific problems, and that makes them feel valued. And I think a third point to that is just it gives clarity, essentially.
Sure.
Like, you know, we're constantly like, you know, people that, well, a species that hates ambiguity and uncertainty, and like this kind of just provides a bit of clarity with, you know, what situation is actually occurring.
Yeah, you can't really over communicate, really. Like you're basically clearly communicating. Not only have you listened to them, but you've taken their very specific. I mean, in the context of the Nike shoes, the example they gave at the beginning, I think it's pretty awesome. It's a bit like when you go speak to a customer service, right? And you know, you're on a chat, like an online chat, and you're like, they're like, I'll go speak to my boss now. And you're like, okay, cool, but what are you going to say? Whereas if they're like, I'm going to speak to my boss now about your package that's missing, and that you know, and then list your gripes. You're going to be like, wow, this person's really understood it. And I know they're going to communicate very clearly what I said to them, to their boss. and that instantly makes you feel better. And it's just a simple change, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can almost copy and paste what you sent them and just say, like,
Literally.
just to clarify, this is what you said. I'm going to speak to my boss about exactly this. Boom.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, cool. Amazing.
Yeah. No, exactly.
So the next part is making the abstract concrete. So why don't we always use concrete language if it's so effective? And the truth is, once we become experts in something, we start to think and speak more abstractly. We get caught up in the big ideas and forget that others may not see the full picture. So let's be clear about this. Abstract language is often the result of something called the curse of knowledge, which we discussed before and made to stick. When you know a lot about a topic, you tend to explain things in a way that makes sense to you, but not necessarily to someone with less of a background in the subject. For example, saying we need to ideate solutions is abstract, it's hard to visualize what it means, but saying we need to brainstorm 3 ways to cut costs, it's more concrete and much easier to understand. The more specific and detailed we are, the more likely people are to grasp what we're talking about.
Yeah, and we've talked about this a lot, but it does make a massive difference, especially when you're trying to communicate something or
For
teach
sure.
something. All right, so moving on to number 3 then. Know when it's better to be abstract. So now, concreteness is powerful, but there are times when abstract language actually works better. When you're pitching an idea or presenting a vision for the future, abstract language can make something seem bigger and more ambitious. And here's something that might surprise you. Investors and leaders often prefer abstract language because it allows them to imagine potential growth. For example, if Uber had been described simply as a ride-hailing app, it might not have seemed very exciting. But by pitching it as a transportation solution revolutionizing how we get from A to B, the founders opened up a world of possibilities. Abstract language can make ideas seem grander, giving them more room to expand. It works when you're trying to inspire or present a visionary idea that's not limited to specific details. And I think it also, a point that I took from the book was that, like they said, it allows people to imagine it on a larger scale, but also on a future scale as well. Concreteness kind of grounds it in the here and now. Whereas, like, if you want to be able to imagine something down the line, how it can turn into something much bigger, then just a ride-hailing app concretes it into, well, this is my idea of an app, and this is what ride-hailing means. But if the other description of Uber kind of allows it to, you can go down many different avenues and imagine it to, like you said, a grander scale.
Yeah, for sure. I do agree with that. I think selling a vision needs enough abstract words for people to project their dreams and visions onto it almost. If you leave it a bit more broad rather than very clearly defined, it allows people to, I guess, you hear certain words and it means different things to different people because they're not so specific. And then it allows them to almost dream on the idea of the dream. And therefore, you're almost getting a collective buy-in because they're almost like projecting what their vision would be as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So here's the action plan then. So here's how we can apply the key ideas from this chapter to improve your communication with concreteness. So number 1, use concrete language to make people feel heard. So in your next conversation, be specific when responding to someone. Instead of generic phrases like, I'll help you with that, use more concrete descriptions like, I'll help you find these documents by tomorrow morning. This will make people feel more understood. 2, make the abstract concrete for clarity. So when explaining something complicated, focus on turning abstract ideas into concrete terms. For example, instead of saying increase productivity, say complete 5 tasks by noon. This will make your message clearer and more actionable. And then 3, know when to be abstract for visionary thinking. When pitching a big idea or talking about long-term goals, it's okay to use abstract language. Focus on the why rather than the how. For example, instead of saying we'll improve customer service by answering calls faster, say we're going to revolutionize how our customers experience support.
Exactly. All right, so moving on to chapter 5, employ emotion. So what if making mistakes could actually help you succeed? That sounds weird, doesn't it? I mean, it might sound strange, but under the right circumstances, showing a little vulnerability can make you more relatable and trustworthy. This chapter explores how emotions, both positive and negative, can be powerful tools when used effectively. We'll dig into why imperfections can be an asset and how to use emotional language to create stronger connections.
So, when imperfections are an asset, there's something called the pratfall effect, which suggests that when competent people make small mistakes, it actually makes them more likable. So let me share a truth that changes everything. Flawless success can make someone seem distant and hard to relate to. But when someone who is generally capable makes a mistake, it humanizes them. It shows that they're not perfect, and that makes them more approachable. So think of it this way. If all you know about someone is that they've been successful at everything they've done, it's really hard to empathize with them. But when they fumble, you're reminded that they're human, just like you. This effect can be a powerful way to connect with others emotionally. I think it's quite interesting as well, because
Yeah.
there is also, though, a separate like industry. If you think about like gossip magazines, where this is almost even more interesting, where I guess it's because these celebrities are always pictured to have like the perfect lives, so people
Yes.
want to like drag them down with that like envy. They're almost like waiting on the sidelines just to hear the latest, shitstorm that's gone through their lives.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. So it's almost in the celebrities, benefit to just make a fumble now and then.
No, but to do it in a way that it conveys that they're fumbling almost like on
Yes.
their own terms, rather than
Yeah.
waiting for something like a big like a cheating scandal or whatever.
Yes, no, that's not really a fumble. That's it.
Yeah, no, but do you get what I mean? Like it's almost like I guess the privatization of themselves, like where they just hide themselves from the paparazzi, means everybody's even more hungry to tear them down. Whereas if you look at some of like social media influencers, I guess the ones who are the hardest to attack in the media are probably the ones who just admit their faults and are open about them.
Yeah.
Because like you can't really hurt them, right? Because they're literally like, I'm an idiot. I did this and this and this.
Yeah.
Whereas the ones who portray a perfect image, are the ones that one we don't relate to, but then also people want to tear down because they're like, this person's obviously not perfect because we know nobody's perfect.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. All right, so let's build a roller coaster. We all love a good story, whether it's in a movie, book, or even just conversation with a friend. But what makes a story great? It's not just a happy moment. In fact, it's the ups and downs, the emotional highs and lows that make stories compelling. And here's something most people miss. Successful stories balance positive and negative moments. The more emotional contrast, the more gripping the story becomes. Jonah Berger's research found that movies with the biggest emotional swings from despair to joy were the ones people enjoyed the most. Think of it as a roller coaster. The lows make the highs feel more exhilarating. If everything were perfect all the time, the story would be flat and boring. So when telling your own stories, whether personal or professional, don't shy away from sharing the struggles. Those low moments make the victories all the more powerful and sweet.
I mean, that just makes a load of sense, doesn't it, really? Like, there's nothing exciting about a story where there's just like no jeopardy, no stakes, everything's okay.
The contrast.
Exactly. Weirdly enough, in my head, then I was just thinking about because I've been watching all the Marvel films all over again, like how I guess if people are listening, it doesn't matter, they probably would have seen it by now. But like Infinity War, where it ends on that like sort of they've all failed. There's a massive low moment, which I think makes the whole second film obviously way more compelling, and also it breaks that like film mold where the good guys always win by the end of the film kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So 2, we're looking now at the value of volatility. So emotionally charged stories aren't just about hitting highs and lows. They're about keeping the audience on their toes. Look at that bit of rhyme. Unpredictability keeps people engaged. 2 stories might have similar highs and lows, but if one is steady and predictable, while the other is emotionally volatile, it's the volatile one that will hold people's attention. When people aren't sure what will happen next, they're more likely to stay engaged. Great stories, just like roller coasters, don't just rise and fall. They twist and turn in unexpected ways. This unpredictability is a key to keeping an audience captivated.
All right, so moving on to number 3 then, consider the context. So not all emotions are created equal, and the impact of emotional language depends heavily on the context. The key point when you strip everything away is this. Emotional language works better in some situations than others. For example, when you're talking about hedonic products like music, movies, or novels, emotional language is a huge asset. People want to hear how a song made you feel or how a movie moved you. But for more utilitarian products like a razor or a dishwasher, emotional language can actually backfire. Consumers looking for these products care more about functionality than feelings. If you're reviewing a razor saying it was life-changing, might seem out of place. Instead, focusing on practical benefits like well-built or good value will resonate more. I mean, I don't know what, a razor has to do to make it life-changing. Depends, I guess, where you're shaving. So when marketing or pitching an idea, think about the context. If it's an emotional product, lean into those feelings. If it's a practical product, Focus more on the facts.
So, number 4, activate uncertainty. Now let's talk about one of the most powerful ways to keep people engaged, using language that creates a sense of uncertainty. Research shows that certain emotions, especially those tied to uncertainty like anxiety or surprise, can keep people glued to a story or article. For example, if an article evokes anxiety about the future or uncertainty about the outcome, readers are 30% more likely to stick with it until the end. Why? Because uncertainty triggers a desire to resolve the unknown. It makes people want to find out what happens next. Compare that to emotions like sadness or disgust, which tend to push people away. So if you want to hold your audience's attention, use language that sparks curiosity or leaves them with questions they need answered.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting point, actually. I quite liked it. All right. So the action plan for this chapter. So here's how you can apply these ideas to leverage emotion in your communication. So number 1, use vulnerability to build trust. Don't be afraid to show imperfections. When you make a small mistake or share a struggle, it makes you more relatable and likable. Then number 2, add emotional swings to your stories. Whether you're telling a story in a presentation or writing an email, try to balance positive and negative moments. And highlight the challenges as well as the successes to create emotional contrast. Then number 3, choose the right emotional tone for the context. When discussing emotional products like art or entertainment, use more feeling-based language, but for practical, everyday items, focus on facts and utility. And then lastly, number 4, create engagement with uncertainty. Keep your audience engaged by introducing elements of uncertainty. Use language that makes them curious about what happens next or anxious to find a resolution.
Chapter 6, harness similarity and difference. So let's start with a question. Why do some people stay in a group for years while others leave just after a few months? One of the key factors is the language they use. In this chapter, we explore how adapting to a group's language, its unique phrases, style, and tone can help you fit in. But we'll also see why sometimes standing out is just as important as fitting in. The magic lies in knowing when to blend in and when to be different.
Yes, so signaling similarity. So organizations talk a lot about culture. They want to create environments where everyone works well together, shares common goals, and speaks the same language, literally and figuratively. But what does that really mean? Well, one of the most overlooked aspects of fitting into a group is linguistic style. The words you use, the way you phrase things, these can signal whether you're part of the team or not. So here's something most people miss. Linguistic similarities play a big role in how well you fit in with a group. When you use the same phrases or jargon as the rest of your team, you're signaling that you're part of the culture. Whether it's pivoting in a startup or omni-channel in retail or junked up in Wall Street lingo, I
Not
don't know what
bricked
that
up.
means, but yeah, matching the language helps you build rapport and trust. So studies have shown that employees who adapt their language to fit the company culture often receive better evaluations, higher bonuses, and are more likely to be promoted. Simply put, when you sound like part of the team, people see you as part of the team.
Yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory. I think everybody gets that to some level. But I guess it's being conscious to do it.
Yes, exactly.
So, number 2 from this chapter. So, when similarity is good and difference is better. Now, while fitting in can help you build connections, sometimes it's not enough. Here's where things get interesting. People naturally crave novelty. Doing or hearing the same thing repeatedly can get boring. So that's where the differentiation comes in. For instance, in the workplace, fitting in by using the same language and following established practices can help you succeed. But in more creative fields like music, movies, or the arts, standing out is crucial. Think about how the musical Hamilton broke the mold by mixing hip hop with traditional theatre. The creative departure from the norm made it a hit. So when is it better to stand out? Differentiation is especially useful when you need to be memorable. In everyday teamwork, fitting in builds trust and cooperation. But when you want to be innovative or leave a lasting impression, being different is what will set you apart.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this is commonsensical, but I think, like you just said, it's when people it's consciously doing this stuff, with intentionality. All right, so number 3, plot the right progression. So just as language can help you fit in or stand out, the way you structure a conversation or a story matters too. The pace at which you move between ideas can make a huge difference. See, the best stories often start slow, letting the audience get to know the characters, setting, and relationships. This is where similarity helps. Everyone gets on the same page. But once the groundwork is laid, the story needs to pick up. Moving too slowly can lose the audience's interest. On the other hand, too much action, too soon, can overwhelm them. Think of it like a roller coaster. You need the steady climb before the thrilling drop. And in conversations or presentations, it's the same. Start slow to build a connection, then accelerate to keep the momentum going. And I mean, this, once again, this is very straightforward, but it makes a lot of sense. It's like, when you start watching a film, obviously you're introduced to the characters. It's a bit slower so that you get to know them, so that you kind of pick a side, and then all the it builds up, and that's a kind of 3-stage process. But I think it's very important to know where you are in the structure of things and when to introduce similarity or differences.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where the intentionality comes back, right? It's the awareness and then the remembering that you could use either one of these tools to have the desired effect.
Yeah, exactly.
So, action plan for the chapter. So here's how you can apply the key ideas from the chapter to harness both the similarity and the difference in your communication. So as we said originally, adapt your language to fit in. So whether you're joining a new team or entering a new social group, listen to the way people speak, adopt similar phrases and terms to signal that you're part of the group. 2, differentiate when you need to stand out. In creative or competitive situations, don't be afraid to be different. Whether it's in a pitch or a presentation, use language and ideas that break the mold to make a lasting impression. And then lastly, control the pace of your stories or conversations. Start slow to establish context and build trust, then increase the pace as the discussion or narrative progresses. This keeps people engaged without overwhelming them.
Yeah, and that brings us to the conclusion. So as we wrap up today's journey into the incredible impact of language, let's take a moment to reflect on what's actually at stake. See, words are more than just tools for communication. They are the drivers of change, connection, and influence. And we've explored how the right words can activate identity, convey confidence, and build relationships. But now it's time to look ahead. So here's the heart of the matter. The words you choose today can shape the reality of tomorrow. And if you remember only one thing, let it be this. Language isn't just a tool. It's a force for transformation. So whether you're persuading a room full of executives, your boss, leading a team, or simply having a conversation with a loved one, the magic of words is always within your grasp. So ask yourself this: what future will your words create? So let's take pride in our ability to inspire, to lead with clarity and conviction. And let's have hope in the possibilities that our words can unlock new opportunities, stronger connections, and build greater influence. And most of all, let's embrace the power of language to build bridges, solve problems, and create a better world. Because as Churchill said, give us the tools and we will finish the job. And your greatest tool it's the words you choose to speak. Now, go out and use them wisely. From Wise Words.
Woo!
Bam!
Oh, Jesus Christ. Oh, is it hot there? Oh, I'm going to faint. Woo! I got chills. Anyway, and that is a wrap. Thank you for listening.